It is Tax Day 2019. Here to talk next about the impact of the 2017 law and how the 2018 returns going are Pete Sepp, who is president of the National Taxpayers Union, Josh Bivens, who is the director of research at the Economic Policy Institute. Both of you may have heard some of the conversation the first hour, how it's affecting some of our viewers and listeners. Overall, we'll start there. How do you think, Pete Sepp, the 2018 returns look for most people?
Well, the predictions have been that about 80% of filers would experience some kind of tax reduction on their return, 5% an increase, the remainder roughly even. It seems to be working out that way. We won't know for sure until all the filing data is in, and more people are actually delaying their filing, applying for an extension. So that's going to have some important data we're not going to know about for a little while. Economically, I think the honest answer is it's way too early to tell what the overall impact is going to be. You see signs in employment and wage growth and fixed investment, but whether that's short or long term, no one can be sure of that. Plus the fact that, look, the intent of the tax reduction law really was not to deliver immediate kinds of boosts through the corporate reduction, at least. It was to affect investment over the long term. That's very hard to pin down, especially when you have other things going on, like the trade war that the Trump administration has launched. That impacts the economy probably in a negative way.
And Josh Bivens, from what you've seen and heard so far, your take on the impact of the 2018 returns. What do you think it looks like compared to previous years?
I think in terms of individuals doing their taxes, it very much depends on their circumstance. I mean, the one thing we should keep in mind is that the centerpiece of the law in 2017 was a corporate income tax reduction. And so that's not affecting individual people's returns. And so the way that's going to filter through the economy is people who own corporate equities are going to get higher dividends, higher capital gains in sort of future years. Probably hasn't filtered through this year. That's a very skewed toward the top set of people. For the rest, I think it really depends on whether or not people get business income or not. One of the other big pieces of the law was a deduction for sort of pass-through income. For people who get most of their income from W-2 wages, I think any effect of the law is just going to be swamped by the year-to-year variation in what they make, and so they're not going to see a big effect. And I think economy-wide, there's very little evidence that the tax cut has done anything at all to help boost the economy, and I don't think it will, but it certainly has not so far.
Pete Sepp, you mentioned, you said that people, from what you're seeing, people have delayed in filing this year a bit. Is that because the newness of the law, or do we know what that reason is?
Potentially, I think it's the newness of the law. We do annually a study of complexity and administration in the tax system. One of the big questions was, are the 15 or 20 million folks who normally use the so-called 1040 long form with all of its associated schedules and the like to take itemized deductions, will those people shift into the newer form and opt to fill out fewer schedules, take the standard deduction instead? It seems that that trend is being confirmed right now, and that's important because one of the few, and I mean few, simplification gains from this law was that more people would take the standard deduction. That could mean a reduction in paperwork burdens of about 250 million hours.
But that, Josh Bivens, that reduction in the more people taking that standard deduction means fewer people are itemizing or get to itemize. It looks like that's where some of the bite might be for some taxpayers. They're not able to deduct what they used to.
Well, I would say, cards on the table, not a big fan of the law in general. The one piece I think was pretty decent was the increase in the standard deduction, both for simplification. I think all else equal, it's better to not. And it's hard to imagine too many people being made worse off. I mean, basically, if you didn't have $24,000 in deductions before, then the standard deduction gives you that much and you're fine. I think a lot of, I think taxes change for people year to year, just their income changes, their employer withholds more or less in a given year. And so I think people are trying to figure out why their taxes have changed. I don't think the shift from the bigger standard deduction and some of the caps on the itemized is probably the thing driving it. I think all else equal, that was actually probably a pretty good thing.
Our guests, Josh Bivens and Pete Sepp, with us to talk about the effect of the 2018 tax returns, of the effect of the 2017 law. welcome your comments and calls too. Republicans, it's 202-748-8000. For Democrats, 202-748-8001. And for all others, 202-748-8002. Some of the effect of the tax law from the Wall Street Journal. First of all, the Wall Street Journal is reporting the biggest winners were shareholders. Tax savings contributed to a banner year for banks, with the 6 largest banks surpassing $120 billion in combined profits for the first time. Dividend and stock buybacks at the 23 lenders have surged by an additional $28 billion from 2017, even more than their tax saving. They also write that businesses have been electing to give workers short-term payouts for retention and morale rather than the long-term increases in wage increases the economy had experienced in previous decades. Anecdotally, says the Wall Street Journal, the trend of bonuses rather than a permanent wage increase continues. A recent report by the Federal Reserve showed that employers in the Atlanta Fed District were increasing the proportion of employee compensation that is not permanent. It can be withdrawn. So we've seen this in a number of industries across the country. Is this a new fixture that is likely to be a permanent fixture instead of a pay raise? A bonus becomes part of the equation.
Well, I certainly hope not. I mean, the intent of the tax cut law was to increase private investment over the long term as well as productivity, which shows up in wage growth. Now, Doug Holtz-Eakin, a former CBO director, testified at a hearing about 2.5 weeks ago or so on the short-term impacts of the law, and he stressed that's not really where we should be observing the beneficial economic impacts. He thought that, for example, private investment is up a little bit, fixed investment as part of GDP trending northward, some of the wage growth trending northward. Can that be attributable fully to the tax cut law? No, probably not. You can't isolate policies that easily. But at least it's an encouraging sign that 2 or 3 years from now, we might still have a little bit of wind in the sails of this economy.
Josh Bivens, you mentioned not a fan overall of the tax law. That part of that law reduces the corporate tax rate from, I think, 35% to 21%. What have we seen as the impact, the outcome of that so far?
So far, you've seen a really big increase in after-tax profitability of corporations.
Such as we just mentioned in banks and such?
Exactly. Yeah. Some of that has been given to their shareholders in the form of higher dividends, or maybe they got a capital gain because of a stock buyback. That is all a set of benefits that really accrue to the very top. I mean, basically the top 1% owns almost 40% of corporate equities in the U.S. economy. So that is not a broad-based sort of increase in income for people. I think that the tax cut architects and proponents, they hope eventually that lower corporate tax rate does filter down and spur some more tangible investment that increases productivity. The evidence for that is pretty weak. I mean, if you look at when the tax cut was passed, you see no change at all in the trend of private investment. You can always say it might take more time. It hasn't happened yet. And I would just argue, I think even over time, I'm dubious it'll happen because we've had record high after-tax corporate profitability before the tax cut, and yet investment was kind of sluggish. And so that says to me that that wasn't the thing holding back investment in this economy. Like, low profitability was not the thing holding back investment because profitability was really high. And so I don't understand the prescription that says it was really high before, let's nudge it up even higher, and maybe that will turn the tables. And so that's why I'm dubious about the long-term
On
effects.
the personal side, you do research for the Director of Research for the Economic Policy Institute. So what sort of signs are you looking for the effect of the law, say, a month, 2, 3, or 4 months out?
It's really tough in that kind of short term. I think what you look for is, one, what happens to after-tax corporate profitability, because that's the part of the law that just changed overnight. I mean, corporate taxes went from the statutory rate from 35% to 21%, and you see that clear as day in the data. Basically, corporations had to pay a much lower rate of taxes on their profits, and you see that jump. And then what you look at over time, I think the real linchpin of the law in terms of its effect on helping a broader group in the economy is what happens to private sector investment. I mean, the entire sort of economic case for why this might be a thing that's good for a broad group of people is it'll spur business investment. And so you look at trends in business investment, and that's what I really am focusing on.
Pete Sepp, those are the sorts of things you're looking at in terms of what the overall effect down the road, 6 months, a year of the 2017 law?
Well, most certainly, because as Josh said, this was geared primarily toward a major reduction in corporate income tax. The other key component is the so-called